Hello everyone, my name is Hailey Elizabeth, and if you don't know who I am, this is my true crime podcast where once a week I sit down and I talk about all things true crime, ranging from murders, disappearances, cults, all the way to the biggest drug bust in history, the biggest bank heist in history, all things true crime. So if you're interested in any of that, you could head over to Spotify, Apple, wherever you could find podcasts every Tuesday for the audio version, or you can head over to the YouTube channel every Wednesday for the visual version. And for today's case, we're going to be talking about the case of Taylor Van Diest. Now there is a lot to get through, so we're just gonna hop right into it. And also a little disclaimer before going into the video, I'm sorry if at times I sound very stuffy. It's because I'm sick right now, so please excuse that. On October 31st of 2011 in Armstrong, British Columbia, Canada, the town is located about 5 hours away from Vancouver and was described to be a very sleepy and rural town. The population was 5,000 and the town was located more in the upper mountains of Canada. And in 2011, Armstrong was home to 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest. Taylor was born in 1993 in British Columbia, Canada, to her mother Marie and her twin sister Christy. And Taylor was particularly very excited this day because it was Halloween, and Taylor loved Halloween. She was obsessed with horror movies and ghost stories and anything that had to do with Halloween. It was by far her favorite holiday, and Taylor was really excited to go out this night with her friends because just recently she had graduated high school, and a lot of her family and friends said that during this time she was just going through a very rough transitional phase. Because I feel like when we're younger, we're kind of told what the next steps are to do. Like when you're in elementary school, you go to middle school, then middle school, you go to high school. But after high school, it's very 50-50 of where you want to go. You can go to college, you can go to trade school, you can go to neither and start your own business or go on another business venture. So there was just a lot of options for Taylor, and she was very overwhelmed by all of these choices and didn't really know what to do. And so she was really looking forward to Halloween just to hang out with her friends and get her mind off of it. Plan that night was for Taylor to leave her house and go to her friend's house where all of her other friends were meeting up at, and once all of her friends arrived at the house, they from there were going to go trick-or-treating. And after Taylor was done trick-or-treating, she would then walk to her boyfriend Colton's house. And at 5:45 p.m. she left the house, she said bye to her mom and her sister, and she was on her way to her friend's house. While walking to her friend's house, she was texting all of her friends, telling her that she was on the way. She dressed up as a zombie that night, so she was telling her friends all about her costume. And she was also texting her boyfriend Colton, just letting him know where she was and that she was on the way to her friend's house. And it wasn't until about 6 p.m. that night where Colton would receive a text message from Taylor that just said, quote, "being creeped." Colton receives this text and he's kind of worried, and so he texts back, but he received no response. So he waits a little while later, about 20 minutes, and he tries to text her again, but again there was no response. And this was really odd for Taylor specifically because, as I said, literally on the way from her house to her friend's house, she was texting her friends, she was telling them all about her costume, she was texting her boyfriend. Taylor was a really big texter and she loved to just interact with her friends, and so the fact that she wasn't responding, it was very concerning to Colton. Then 2 hours go by and Colton still receives no response from Taylor, and so that's what he starts contacting Taylor's friends. Hey, did Taylor show up already? Like, she's not responding. And her friends said no, Taylor hasn't shown up yet, and they also haven't heard anything from her in a while. And so now her friends are all trying to text her, but again there's no response. And so that's when Taylor's friend calls Taylor's mother to ask her if Taylor had even left the house, but when they called her mother said yeah, she left here around 5:45, and now the mother was calling and texting Taylor, but still again with no response. Now the route that Taylor was taking from her house to her friend's house, usually people would walk alongside these train tracks basically as a shortcut to get from one side of town town to the other. And so on this night, a group of teens were walking along the train tracks just celebrating Halloween when all of a sudden they hear a small buzzing sound in the distance. They follow the buzzing sound and what they find is a phone. And so they pick up the phone, they start looking through it, and they see that there's a bunch of missed calls and text messages from what seems to be like very concerned family and friends. So these group of teens take the phone and they're responding to text messages and telling everyone like, hey, we don't know who you're looking for. We just randomly found this phone on the train tracks. Whoever you're trying to contact maybe just accidentally dropped their phone, but just to let you know, we found it and it's here. And so that's when Colton, Taylor's mom, and Taylor's friends all go out to the train tracks in search for Taylor because they knew it's been about 2 hours since Taylor left the house, and it doesn't take 2 hours to go from Taylor's house to her friend's house. And so if Taylor did accidentally drop her phone, she would have made it to her friend's house by now. And so that's when everyone started to get a really bad feeling about all of this. So her mom, her boyfriend, and her friends go to the train tracks and they're looking around, they're calling out Taylor's name, and they start specifically looking into this wooded area near the train tracks. And while they're searching, they also call the police. So they're searching around this wooded area, and that's when Taylor's mom in the distance sees a lump. And so when she starts to approach this lump closer, she realizes that it's a young woman's body covered in blood. So she walks closer, and when she flips the body around, that is when she discovers the body of Taylor. Taylor at the time was still alive, but she was barely breathing and mumbling random things, and Taylor's mom was actually a first responder. So she tries to do as much as she could with Taylor and just tell Taylor to hold on, fight it off, that she's gonna make it through. And then right after this, they immediately call for an ambulance. Taylor was taken to the hospital and she was found with severe head trauma, skull fractures, ligature marks on her neck, defensive wounds, and her nails had blood underneath them. So whoever had done this to her, she was trying to fight for her life and fight off her attacker. Now, although Taylor had made it to a hospital, unfortunately, she had suffered way too much brain and skull damage where she eventually slipped into a coma. And unfortunately, the next morning, Taylor had passed away. So once Taylor had passed away, the police were now looking into this case as a homicide because there's no way that Taylor could have done this to herself. There was just way too much damage done to her body. And so that's when the police start interviewing some neighbors surrounding the train tracks. And surprisingly, all of the neighbors said that they did hear screaming coming from that direction, but they just didn't really think too much of it because it was Halloween. They heard screaming all night long. There were just, kids running around, yelling, screaming, kids trying to spook their friends. There was even one woman in particular that was outside in her front yard lighting her pumpkins, and she heard a blood-curdling scream coming from specifically the train track area. But again, it was Halloween. People were screaming all night long. She didn't really think much of it. And so since this murderer was on the loose, the police put out a statement and advised everyone to not walk alone at night. And so a week goes by, there's not really much that the police are getting except for a letter that actually comes into the police station. This letter is said to be written by the killer of Taylor, and in the letter it basically just said that I am the killer, I killed Taylor, and I also plan on killing multiple other women in the area that are walking alone at night. Now this letter was obviously a really big shock to the police because they thought that this was their killer, but after a little bit more analysis, they found that this letter was just a hoax. There was a lot of things in there, details that didn't really match up with the crime scene, and they were pretty big details, like things that the murderer would know, such as the placement of Taylor's body, where her body was found, around what time her body was found. Just big details like that this letter didn't really match up with, and so they just put it off as a hoax. And so almost a month later, at the end of October, that's when the police get their very first breakthrough in the case. They tested the blood and DNA that was found under Taylor's fingernails, and the DNA did come up as a match, but not to a specific person, but to another previous attack of a woman. This attack happened to a masseuse back in 2005. She was SA'd and later murdered, and the DNA underneath her fingernails were tested. It didn't test positive to anyone in their database, so the case unfortunately just went cold until now, 6 years later, they're finally finding a link. But luckily, back in 2005, there was actually a witness to this murder, and so the witness gave a sketch to the police. So the police took that old sketch and aged him a little bit and then released that sketch to the public. The sketch was of a white man, 5'10" and around 20 years old, but at this point in 2011, he would have been 27 to 28 years old. As I said, this town had a population of about 5,000, and so if this man did live in the area, he was going to be pretty easy to spot. And also in the sketch, he had this very specific triangular beard, which is again something you don't really see often on people. Once they released this sketch out to the public, the station would receive over 1,000 phone calls from people all over the area claiming to know who this person is, and they know their name. Now, a lot of these calls did just lead to dead ends. They didn't really go anywhere, but there were dozens of calls that did include a very specific name, and that was the name of Matthew Forrester. Matthew Forrester lived in Cherryville, which was about an hour away from Armstrong. He was born in 1994 in Canada to his father, Stephen. Matthew not only matched the description perfectly, but he was also known for being very emotional and aggressive. And ironically, when the police tried to contact Matthew to try to get him in for questioning, they call Matthew's home phone, but there's no answer. So they call his cell phone and there's still no answer. So the police tried to go off to his apartment in Cherryville to meet him in person, but when they knock on the door, there's no answer from the inside. And so the police decide to break down the door. But when they break down the door, his apartment is completely clean. There's no furniture, no clothes. There's only like a couple of items there, but it seemed as if Matthew had just vanished. Because what reason would Matthew have to leave so randomly? So that's when the police decide to talk to his landlord in hopes that maybe his landlord knew a couple of things about where Matthew went. And so the landlord said that ironically, the day after Halloween, Matthew had approached him and said that he needed to move out that day and he needed his security deposit. But the landlord said, I can't just give you your security deposit. Like, there's a lot of papers that have to go through. I physically don't even have the money right now. Like, it's gonna take a couple days for it to come in. And on top of all of that, Matthew was also leaving very suddenly. He was leaving in the middle of his lease term. And if you guys have ever had an apartment or anything like that before, you know that if you leave in the middle of your lease term, there's a lot of things that go into that. You need to pay certain amounts, like the next month's rent. So there was just a lot of things to be done before Matthew could just up and leave. But Matthew basically just said, screw it, I don't need the deposit, and packed up all of his things and left that same exact day. The landlord said that Matthew didn't mention why he needed to leave very quickly or where he was going. He just said that he needed to leave that day. So that's when the police try to contact Matthew's family in hopes that maybe Matthew is just lying low with a family member right now. So they get in contact with his father, Stephen, and Stephen tells the police that the reason why Matthew needed to leave so quickly was because he actually got a new job working in the oil fields, and this job really needed him on short notice, and it was a really good paying job. It was a job that Matthew just could not turn down, and so that's why he needed to leave so quickly. The day after Halloween, on November 1st, Matthew calls his dad, and he's basically just ranting to his dad of like, oh, I have this new job and it pays all this money and I need to move out immediately, but my landlord isn't giving me my deposit back and there's too much stuff for me to move right now. And so that's when Steven is like, calm down, it's gonna be all right. You go to your new job, you start to move in, and I'll pack up all of your things for you so you don't have to worry about that. And that's exactly what happened. Matthew left and Steven went to Matthew's apartment and packed up all of his things for him. And although this was the story that Steven was giving, the police didn't really believe Steven, mostly because of Steven's background. Steven Forrester, since 1969, has had an intensive and ongoing criminal record, with him going in and out of jail every couple years. And his charges on his record varied from everything under the sun. He has gotten charges like auto theft, escaping police custody, drugs, offenses, domestic violence, possession of a deadly weapon. And so the police knew that there was something a lot more than just Matthew up and leaving because of his new job. And so they decided to search a little bit more. And so that is when the police, as I said earlier, when they went into his apartment, there was a couple of objects in there. So they take as much as they can and they test the DNA on these objects and found that the DNA on these objects matched perfectly with the DNA that was found underneath Taylor's fingernails and the masseuse's nails back in 2005. So now the police definitely have their killer. They know for a fact that Matthew is the killer, but where is Matthew? They still have no clue where he went. So that's when the police bring Steven into the station to try to put a little bit more pressure on him, hoping that he would crack. But Steven does not crack. He is not going to snitch on his son. That is becoming very apparent to the police because Steven is acting very aloof. He's acting like he doesn't know where Matthew went. He doesn't even know where Matthew's new job is. He basically just knows nothing. And hours go by into this interrogation until Steven eventually asks for a lawyer and the interview stops. And so the police are starting to hit a lot of dead ends and they're starting to feel like this is just a lost cause, speaking with Steven, but also what other leads do they have, until a friend of Matthew calls the police because I guess this friend got word that the police were looking into Matthew. So the friend of Matthew calls the police and tells them that his nephew actually got into like a little bit of trouble with some people that he owed money to. And so one day his nephew and Matthew are talking and Matthew tells the nephew that he is in need of a new identity, and ironically his nephew needed lots of money. And so what they did was the nephew decided to sell his identity, mind you, for $500. That's it. He literally sold his whole identity to Matthew for $500 so Matthew could get what he wanted and he could get a new identity, but the nephew also got the money that he needed. So his nephew sold his identity to Matthew for $500. Matthew was able to obtain a fake driver's license with Matthew's picture on it. This nephew gave Matthew his old bank cards as well as his social security and birth certificate. And so Matthew was no longer going by Matthew Forrester, but he was now going by Lee Shaw Cross. But the police know that Matthew is no longer going underneath that name and he's now Lee Shaw Cross. It's nice to know that he has like a new identity, but at the same time, the police still have no clue where Matthew went. They don't know if he's still in Cherryville, if he's in Armstrong, if he's in Canada in general. The police know that Steven knows a lot more than he's letting on. And so that's when the police decide to tap into Steven's phone in hopes of learning some information. And it wasn't long until a flood of phone calls were coming in from Matthew. Matthew actually frequently called his dad. He probably called his dad like 3 to 4 times a day, sometimes just to, say what's up and what's going on. And then other times it was Matthew asking a question. He would just constantly call his dad, but Matthew was very, very careful over the phone. He never mentioned what his new name was. He never mentioned where he was staying or what he was doing. He made sure to keep it very, very low key just in case the police were listening. And so the police have no choice but to just sit back and wait for the day to come where Matthew slips up and says to his dad where he's at. And in March of 2012, 5 months after the murder, that day would finally come. The police find out that after the murder, Matthew had fled to Ontario and he was is currently working at a glass factory in Collingwood. And Matthew just kind of said it very casually in conversation. I'm assuming that since it's been 5 months since the murder, he assumed that things have cooled down and no one's listening to him anymore. So he's on the phone with his dad and he just casually says like, oh yeah, and now I have to drive out to Collingwood every day to work at the glass factory, which was kind of a drive at first, but now I'm used to it. And after Matthew says this, his dad just snaps on Matthew. His father basically just tells Matthew like, what are you doing? Why did you just say that? The police could be listening to us right now. And then he basically just tells Matthew to stop calling him so much and to just never call him again. And so once the police finally found their slip up, that's when they rushed over to Collingwood, went to the glass factory. The police asked for Lee Shaw Cross and arrested him on the spot. Matthew was taken on a plane from his work all the way out to Armstrong, where he was going to be charged with murder while his dad was being charged with aiding a fugitive. And at first, when Matthew was put into questioning, he was super uncooperative with the police. He was basically just playing dumb the entire time. He kept on saying that he didn't know who Taylor was, that he had never done anything like this before, that his name wasn't even Matthew, it was Lee. But the police start to show Matthew a lot more evidence, and we found your DNA underneath her fingernails, and we also found your DNA in 2005 with another attack. And so what are the odds that we find your DNA under the fingernails of 2 women that got attacked and murdered in very similar ways? And I didn't even mention this before, but the masseuse murder back in 2005, that also happened in Armstrong, where Taylor also was murdered. And the police also tell Matthew that they were able to get in contact with his phone provider, and they found out that Matthew, the location of his phone, was in Armstrong the night of Halloween. And so if he lived all the way out in Cherryville, what is he doing in Armstrong on Halloween, ironically the same night that a woman gets murdered, and then his DNA is found on that woman? And they also call out Matthew for changing his identity, because now he went by Lee Shaw Cross, and that is a crime. That's identity theft. If he didn't murder Taylor, he would still be going to jail for identity theft. So then a few hours go by, and that's when Matthew finally starts to crack a little bit. And he starts to crack after an investigator looked him in the eyes and said, quote, "Do you feel bad for killing Taylor?" And I guess this just kind of hit a nerve in him, because immediately after this, he starts to break down and confess to everything. Matthew goes on to say that he was indeed walking in Armstrong that night, but he was mostly just looking for sex. And so he was looking for some sort of escort agency or a sex worker on the streets. And as he was walking around, that is when he came across Taylor, who was walking alongside the train tracks. He thought Taylor at first was a sex worker, and so he started to follow Taylor down these train tracks before realizing that she was dressed up in a Halloween costume. So she's of course not a sex worker, but he just became so infatuated with her that he still began to follow her. And at one point when he was following her, he saw her pull out her phone and start texting, and it's believed that in this moment, that's when she texted, quote, "being creeped" to her boyfriend Colton. Matthew freaked out when he saw that, because he thought that maybe she was texting someone for help or she was going to call the police. So he rushed over to her and tried to spark up a conversation with her. So he said that he walked over there and the two of them began talking for a couple minutes until randomly in the middle of the conversation, he pushes Taylor down to the ground and tells her to be quiet. And Taylor was not quiet. She was fighting for her life. She was screaming at the top of her lungs. She was kicking and scratching, and Matthew started to panic. And so he gets down on the ground and he tries to cover her mouth, but again, she's fighting for her life. And so that's when Matthew pulls out a cord and begins to strangle her. But even though he's strangling her, she's still resisting. She's still screaming. And so at this point, Matthew says says that he just got so frustrated. He took Taylor's head and slammed her head into the concrete 6 times until she was finally quiet. And even though she was already quiet, he then pulled out his mag flashlight, which is a very big heavy-duty flashlight, and began beating her over the head with it. And so that's when he just dragged Taylor's body out into the woods, left her there, and ran away from the scene. And then in March of 2014, 3 years after the murder, that is when Matthew's trial began in Kelowna, Canada. He was found guilty for the first-degree murder of Taylor, but he did accept a plea deal and pled guilty to the first-degree murder of Taylor. But he was not only being charged with Taylor's murder, he was also being charged with the murder of the masseuse back in 2005, and the police found that he was also linked to another attack that happened 6 months prior to the masseuse back in 2005. In this instance, once again, his DNA was found underneath her fingernails, but basically he confessed that he broke into the apartment of a 19-year-old girl, and he broke in while she was sleeping, and he immediately started to beat her while she slept, and then he picked her up, threw her against the wall, and said that he wanted her. But Matthew said that at this point he started to freak out too much because since he was in an apartment building, he was scared that maybe other people heard or saw him. So he didn't murder the woman, but he did beat her very severely and then just left. And so he was being charged with these 3 attacks, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The following month, in April of 2014, that's when Stephen's trial began, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for aiding a fugitive. He was found guilty of this because the whole entire time, the police had tapped into Stephen's phone. The police had asked Stephen if he knew where Matthew was, and he lied to the police and told them that he had no clue where Matthew was. It was also later known that Stephen did know about the 2 attacks previous to Taylor, so he knew that he was the one who murdered the masseuse in 2005, and he also knew that he broke into the apartment of a 19-year-old girl 6 months prior to that, but he didn't go to the police, he didn't say anything to anyone, and so even though Stephen knew that his son most likely would reoffend, he never went to the police. And you would think that that's where this story ends. Matthew and Stephen are now in jail. 2 years later, in 2016, Matthew's lawyer tried to fight for a retrial, and their appeal was actually accepted. Apparently, the judge had made mistakes in giving instructions to the jury, and due to this, he was given a retrial. But before the new trial date was set, Matthew had accepted another plea deal where now he was going to plead guilty for life in prison with no parole for 17 years instead of 25 years. But technically, it was only 15 years because he had already served 2 of them. And so as of today in 2023, Matthew is still in prison. He's currently 39 years old and is said to be released, possibly out on parole, in 2031 at the age of 47. And 47 is still quite young. You still have about 30-40 years left to live your life. And as for Matthew's father, Stephen, I'm assuming that he's released from jail already because he was sentenced to 3 years back in 2014. So it's assumed that he did get out of jail in 2017, but I couldn't find where he is now or if he's back in jail, if he's out on the streets. But I think that's really terrifying that he is released because, if you live in Canada or even near the Cherryville, Armstrong area, he could be, in the same store as you. He could be sitting in the same bus as you, sitting on the same train as you. And so I just think it's extremely unfair that he is out and about. And I also think it's extremely unfair that Matthew is even getting a possibility of parole. I think he should be in jail for the rest of his life with no possibility of parole. And in my personal opinion, so it is very 50-50 if he's going to get parole or not. But in my opinion, I unfortunately do see him getting parole. I feel like his case was really hard to argue because of all of the concrete DNA evidence, but apparently Matthew has a really good legal team if he was able to get a retrial. So I'm assuming that when his time for parole comes up in 2031, given he's had good behavior in jail so far, there's a really big possibility that he could be out on the streets again. But yeah, that is the end of today's case. If you guys found this case interesting, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you are on YouTube. If you want to follow me on any of my socials, like my Instagram, that will be all linked down below, as well as my PO box if you want to send me anything. And yeah, if you are watching the visual version, this comes out the day after Halloween, so I hope you guys had a very fun and safe Halloween. I dressed up as Jesse Pinkman, so that was extremely fun. And overall, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Make sure to be safe out there, go outside, get some sunlight today. Overall, I hope you guys had a wonderful Halloween. I hope you guys watched lots of horror movies and ate lots of candy. And yeah, that's all from me. As always, I love you, I love you, I love you, and I will see you guys next week.